talk to someone in Kansas, you might not bring up high-speed rail. And if you're going to go talk to someone in Rhode Island, you may not talk about rural mobility. I don't know. We also have this three-sheet set here. Very much has to do with kind of those urban corridors. It's high-speed rail, it's the Northeast Corridor, and it's state of good repair. And that's not just for intercity passenger rail, that's transit systems as well. And these really defined the scope of what we're facing. A lot of what we're doing, especially in FY 2020, is kind of this incremental approach where we're saying, all right, we've had some successes, we've been building up year by year, but at some point we are going to have to, instead of just slowly opening the spigot, turn on the fire hose. And these help make the case. And this is, I think, again, a really good document for doing that. We gathered together all the grant applications we could get from the FRA, the Recovery Act, Tiger, high-speed intercity passenger rail program, and looked at the ones that hadn't been funded, which is the majority of them. And we put together about $200 billion worth of projects that if, again, we passed some sort of infrastructure bill that included $100 billion for rail, we could knock out these projects and start construction in a matter of a few years, not a few decades. That's the overview. I want to dive in a little deeper right now. Rail and transit funding for FY 2020. It was slow going, not because of anything in FY 2019, not because of anything transportation oriented, but rather because of this larger shutdown over wall funding and this larger kind of political spat that we found ourselves at the mercy of. We actually did a pretty good job pretty early getting help from the Senate, getting the House on board. It's important remembering that at both houses at this point were controlled by the GOP, and both of them passed pretty good bills for Amtrak, pretty good bills for transit, pretty good bills for intercity passenger rail. So yeah, we really do deserve a lot of credit. We've moved from a hill environment where every year we would have to face, a realistic threat to the national network, to having 94 senators, 96 senators, 95 senators in a GOP-controlled Senate vote saying the national network is essential, it's an essential service to rural America, and Amtrak, you got to keep running it. So we deserve credit for that. We want to build on that. This is the rail passenger FY 2020 request. As you can see, it is it's not an astronomical increase, but it is a significant step up in every single program. I think we do a pretty good case in those sheets I described and explaining why we need to do this. I think we have a really good success case coming from a lot of these programs. We made a concerted effort to include transit grants, and we don't want to be just the intercity rail group. We want to be the rail group, the comprehensive rail passengers, whether you're using BART or whether you're using the Southwest Chief. I'm not going to go through line by line, I don't think. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I will say, Allison talked briefly about Chrissy and how she didn't use the words disappointing. I'm going to use the words disappointing. The speed of delivery has been from the FRA. She question. I'll come to you at the end. Federal-state partnership of good repair. That's really kind of the legacy networks that we have. Talking about like getting that state of good repair backlog down. Chrissy is more the expansionary, forward-looking. It has been used. There's a little bit of blurred lines. It's not really clear because we haven't had enough of a sample size as to what kind of projects get funded. Restoration enhancement grants, that third one at $20 million, that would be That would be your Gulf Coast restoration. So moving on, I think this is a really important thing. We did manage to get it in the handouts you have in front of you. I think it was a close call because they went to print before Amtrak released their FY 2020 Legend Grant. And that was just because of the shutdown. The White House's budget was delayed. We had our meeting early, so it was a big headache, but I think we got it. We ought to recognize Amtrak for doing what we asked them to do, which is we told them the lines on the map are the lines on the map. That's what Congress has decided the national network is going to be. You tell us how much it costs, and then we, the people, through our representatives in Congress, will go out and we'll make the case about why we need to fund them at this level. And this is the result of that. So we have $907 million in federal grants for equipment. That's 533 for national network, 374 for NEC. This does not include. This might be a little confusing. This does not include the money Amtrak has set aside in revenue from tickets and other sources to also invest in the fleet. So it's closer actually to around $2 billion total above FY 2020 for the equipment. I think it's a good thing. Build program, this is formerly Tiger. It's multimodal. It's looking at rail programs, rail projects that help both freight and passengers. It's been good for passenger rail in the past. Recently, under the Trump administration, it's turned more into a road-heavy program. Some of this language that we included, which actually got picked up in FY 2019, is trying to get it back to its intended purpose of projects that don't necessarily fit under highways, don't fit under rail, don't fit under passenger rail grant program. These kind of hybrid projects that don't have a home. Advanced passenger rail appropriations, this was originally the Amtrak idea. They turned us onto it a few years back. It doesn't cost us anything. Under the CBO, it's scored the exact same way. It's just saying, if you're gonna actually spend the money anyway, why don't we just take the next 2 to 3 years and actually define that level of investment, and that way states, Amtrak can have a little predictability. It lowers their costs and it helps them manage their capital expenditure programs. Obviously, OTP, we talked about this, grant Amtrak a private right of action. It's very simple. Because of everything that's going on in the courts, we have, for the minute, shelved one of the previous requests we had about, defining everything within the FRA in terms of setting metrics and standards. I think this is our best course of action. This plus a passionate Amtrak that is actually defending its right of preference, and we're getting that from Amtrak, so this is the next piece. We also have this last thing, more of a messaging bill from Representatives Gottheimer and King, which just directs the FRA to create a contingency plan and define the economic cost of a shutdown, partial or complete, of the Hudson Rail tunnels. I think the point is there is no contingency plan, and it's forcing the FRA, which has been under the current administration a stumbling block to development, to actually publicly stating, like, yes, this would be a disaster. Surface transportation reauthorization, creating a blueprint for rail. Again, we're uncertain about the timeline to this. I thought we would have already been having our first hearings right around now. Because of the shutdown, it's going to be pushed to late summer, early fall. I think you're going to have a chance to talk about this in the Carl Fowler-led panel later. So I don't know how much time. How much time do I have, Bruce?
5 minutes, and there's some logistical questions people want you to talk about.
Logistics for the Hill are going to come after the break, after Mike Friedberg. Okay. So we'll talk about the logistics of actually like how you go lobby educate your member of Congress. Educate your member of Congress on your needs as a constituent. And so we'll talk about the actual like logistics 101 later. I still just want to go through. How much do I have left? Okay, real quick. Reauthorization. Funding and finance, predictable, dedicated funds for rail. Not just Amtrak, but rail. On the physical infrastructure, we've been talking about OTP. The best way, the best solution is to actually just, where possible, create passenger-centric rights-of-way like you see in the Northeast Corridor, like you see between Illinois and Michigan in stretches, so we can be kind of the masters of our own destiny. We've also outlined a financing plan for how you might do that. If the host railroads are going to institute so-called precision railroading and shrink their imprint, we ought to be ready as an industry to rush in behind them, take those rights of way, preserve them, and make sure we're utilizing them to their full capacity. From operations, luckily I don't have to, this is a complex idea, but we talked about it at length in Joe's panel. It's regional rail, it's the German S-Bahn, it's making sure you get through running through New York City and you don't have all these trunk lines meeting together. One of my favorite factoids is the Bay Area has 17 transit authorities. This is not a smart way to run a railroad. It's about, provincialism, local politicians protecting their own turf, I think, in a lot of ways. They're saying if we're contributing money, we want to be able to say where it goes. And it can often be as much about keeping people out as connecting people. Other OTP issues: establish a charter for a shared use corridor advisory committee, of which, of course, we would have a seat. We have this for safety. We should have it for shared use corridors. We actually, in just this room, Jim gave a presentation at Dan Elliott, who used to be a board member for the STB, a shared use event, and it was really interesting. It was a really good conversation. You got the feeling that there's a lot of pent-up ideas, pent-up maybe even frustration, and there ought to be an official channel through which we have those conversations. We also ought to have central dispatching authorities. Hunter Harrison, RIP, said it himself. He said if we were really serious about having Chicago function properly, we would have an air traffic control, but for rail. We ought to look at that. I talked about this a little bit. Formally established the importance of national network to rural Americans. We got that successfully included in FY 2019. Let's get it in the next reauthorization transportation. So it's really a bold part of Amtrak's charter. And grant local officials discretion to direct funds to the highest impact projects. That's a fancy way of saying earmarks. I know earmarks there's a political problem with them. They got a really bad rap through a really deft piece of branding, of marketing, the bridge to nowhere. Listen, competitive grant programs are important. It's a way to create a pipeline of projects. You don't want to just fund a project because someone happens to be a chairman of an important committee, a chair of an important committee. But we don't need a competitive grant program to know that the Hudson River tunnels are important, or that B&B tunnel, or that CREATE, Tower 55. California High-Speed Rail, it's already well-defined. Everyone knows what the project is. We ought to be able to just fund it. Regulation oversight. This is talking about lowering the cost of ensuring passenger rail services. It's really a way to create a more competitive operating environment so that we have more bright lines, more Texas Centrals, and that we get competition, because we've seen in Europe and in the UK specifically, this improve the passenger experience and lower the cost of subsidies. Finally, and it is finally, equipment. Establish a stable funding mechanism. That's basically a carve out within some sort of rail funds where we say we're going to invest in this important piece of our infrastructure puzzle. We shouldn't we shouldn't think of equipment as some sort of like once in a 30-year investment. There are generational opportunities, but you can say with some predictability, this is going to be an ongoing cost, and we ought to cover it. This last thing, again, it's a political. You got to be really careful with your wording here, but allow the FRA and the FTA, I should say, and the FTA, increased flexibility in granting waivers to the Buy American Act. We just don't invest enough in equipment in this country to have that kind of economies of scale that allow us to have a healthy manufacturing chain. You talk to, no one wants to come out and say it on the record, but you talk to a lot of transit operators and they say, we just can't get certain parts within a market-friendly price point. And no European or Japanese company is going to come in and set up a factory for one order. And it's not clear that there's going to be a second order. We've seen what's happening with CAF USA. We've seen what has happened in Rochelle, Illinois. Thank goodness for Siemens. But we ought to exercise a little discretion until the point where we have that predicted dedicated revenue towards equipment, towards the national network, and then at that point we can insist on Buy America. That's an important hyperlink, railpassengers.org/blueprint, as in blueprint for rail reauthorization. It's on a lot of the handouts, so I don't think you need to write it down, but write it down, just be safe. And everything that we hand out, everything that we have, plus more, is going to be in a one-stop shopping experience on that page. And you all should visit it for your own regularly for your own information. But you can certainly, if anyone has questions or wants more or wants to pass something on to someone else, send them to that page, and you'll have those resources. So hopefully we have time for questions. We have a lot of questions. I don't know how much time we have. Oh, sorry. Here's the mic. Don't do George. He asks the hard questions.
No, George. You asked too many hard questions.
Good question. I mean, you asked pretty good questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Sean, one thing we have not discussed is in Amtrak's grant request. They are looking at the 1.8 billion and 600 million. Excuse me, the 1.2 for the national network and the 600 million for the NEC. Total 1.8 billion. Their opening gambit was to transfer 230 million from the national network into the Northeast Corridor, which throws every bit of the numbers in their grant request out of whack. How are we going to deal with this? What should we say to our people on the Hill? Should we say resist Amtrak's request to transfer money from the national network to the NEC?
Well, so this again, I mentioned that it was a late publication of this ledge grant request, so we have not had a time as a coalition. So I think a lot of you have the idea that I kind of make these decisions about what our policy as an association is going to be, and hand it down to you. It really is a lot of me talking to you guys, getting your sense, regional, and trying to triangulate between the different groups. So I really do want to have a conversation before we have an official response. I think you're right to flag it. I think we should flag it in meetings and say Amtrak is transferring money that Congress has authorized for the national network to the Northeast Corridor. This might be double dipping in terms of the accounting. We want to look at it. We want to flag it for you, and we will follow up with you once we've had a chance to talk with each other. And with Amtrak and see how it makes sense and how we're going to make sure we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. I also think it's an opportunity to talk about this idea that if you cut long distance trains, you would save a lot of money. We know that's Just not the case. It's false. It's a lot of this money would be spent anyway. I am a frequent corridor user. I get on the Vermonter. I get on long distance services like the Silver Service regularly without thinking about it. I just grab the time I want. These things overlap. They should overlap more in the rest of the country. They don't, because we're relying on our grandparents and great-grandparents' investment. Maybe your grandparents and great-grandparents' investment. Huh?
That means it's really old.
Yeah, really old, really old.
Yeah, thank you, John.
But I will, one last thing. Let's try to present a unified front.
No way.
You know, I know the narcissism of small differences, you know, there is some sort of like civil war between the West and the East here. It's better if we are able to say, if we have someone in Montana saying the Northeast Corridor is important and someone in Northeast Corridor saying Montana is important. So that's my suggestion, and we can figure it out later, but feel free to
Come on,
flag.
Sean, that's what we always do.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have to tell you guys.
So I need clarification. This equipment issue, of course, is paramount.
Yeah.
You know, it affects the ski train. Everybody's suffering because we don't have it, particularly long-distance trains. Apparently, some of the other trains are going to get some equipment. So the 533 million national network new equipment, that's not on this sheet of paper. That's not in the 2.6 billion capital investment.
No, that's above. That's above and beyond FY 2020 request. They said we're going within what you authorized, but also, if you really want to know what it costs, here it is.
So we need it.
We need it.
We've been talking to our delegation about this, so it's
Yes.
not going to be a surprise. So the 533, who created that number? Where does it come from?
That is Amtrak's number. Amtrak says it's going to cost $947.
47?
947 to do not only a replacement, but an overhaul and a refresh to make sure the equipment they have is not garbage. And so we want to make sure that we've flagged that.
So have they sent that request to Congress? Or we
They have. They have.
Okay. That was in the I'm not sure I saw that in the 5-year plan. Was that there? Those numbers?
It's on the FY 2020 ledge grant request. I don't know where it is on the 5-year plan, but it is on the more important in the current period document, FY 2020 ledge grant. It's on there. We have Steve.
One more.
Somebody flipped to the funding table, like one of the first ones. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the service restoration money, the $20 million. So that was originally put in the FASTAC for the restoration of the service from New Orleans to Jacksonville. It turned out the states didn't really want to fund that, and it hadn't been used. So we need to look at, like, is it flexible enough to use where there are states that would put out some local money? And then the other problem that the feedback I've heard is it would help with operating costs, but you might not have the equipment or the stations to restore the service. So it may be really too small to be useful any place other than New Orleans to Jacksonville. And I think actually Louisiana has applied to restore New Orleans to Mobile as well. So just some pointers to think about on that relatively small but unused piece.
It's true. And it doesn't even touch on access charges for most railroads, which I think could put you could put a drone on Mars for what CSX wants for 1 year of a.
$1 is exactly what we spent to send the Mars rover Mars.
Maybe they can sell seats on the next rover. We're done? Okay.